Hey guys, welcome back to another review. Today we're going to be going over chapter 9 and 10.1. 9 is on test 5 and 10.1 is 6 or 4 and 5. I don't know, they're on different tests. So 9 is going to be on one test, 10 is going to be on your other test. So just like last week's recording, if you want to dip out halfway through, that's great. 9 is a lot longer and in my opinion, a lot harder. So we'll be spending the majority of our time on that today. But let's just jump in. I'm going to be honest, today is the brain. The brain does not have a lot of processes that you can really think through. It's just this structure performs this action. It's very just memorization. There's no processes to think through, really. I'll try to do my best to go quick, stay entertaining, do the whole, just what you need to know. But just forewarning, it's a little bit boring, in my opinion. Maybe you love the brain, then this will be your favorite lecture ever, and that's great. But let's jump in. So chapter 9, the nervous system, brain and cranial nerves. So to start, your brain has these pockets of fluid that are just full of fluid. They help your brain be more buoyant. It helps transport glucose to your brain. Inside these ventricles is your cerebral spinal fluid. The actual pocket itself is called a ventricle. What makes your cerebral spinal fluid, or that fluid that's in these holes in your brain, it's called the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is super important. You're going to need to know pretty much everything about it. So in your book, memorize that definition, know where the choroid plexus is found and what it does. So it's just a capillary network. So little blood vessels in the ventricles of your brain that work with your ependymal cells to create cerebral spinal fluid. The choroid plexus is how we get our cerebral spinal fluid and how we make sure that it's clean, that cerebral spinal fluid doesn't have any waste in it. The main function of our cerebral spinal fluid is protection. Okay, it cushions. So if you think of a boat, if you just had a boat sitting in a bowl, like a mini boat sitting in a bowl, and you rattled that bowl around, that boat would bang against the sides. But if you put cerebral spinal fluid around that boat, make that boat float, then if you shake the bowl, that boat is going to stay in place without hitting the sides of your bowl. So it protects, it cushions. Your brain isn't just sitting in your skull. You saw the pokey little parts of your skull. Your brain's not just sitting on that. It's floating on cerebral spinal fluid, and it's around your entire brain and throughout your ventricles. If you've ever tried to pick someone up in water, they're a lot lighter than if you tried to pick them up on land. So it also makes your brain less heavy because it's floating in water. It allows like glucose, gases, oxygen, nutrients to be able to get to your brain because it travels through the CSF. And then it regulates what can go in and what cannot. So it's very clean. Only the things that are necessary to feed your brain are going to be able to get into that cerebral spinal fluid. And essentially you just have a lot. Your brain cycles through it a lot. Okay, keeping that cerebral spinal fluid, that little pool holding your boat nice and clean. Know the flow of CSF. It goes, if you've had your lab, this will make more sense. If not, just memorize the words. It goes lateral, third, fourth ventricles, central canal of your spinal cord. We learned about that last week. The cranial and spinal subarachnoid spaces, where the arachnoid granulations suck up the old cerebral spinal fluid so it can be recycled. So again, lateral, third, fourth ventricles in that order. Central canal, subarachnoid spaces where the arachnoid granulations suck it back up where it can be recycled. Okay, as we talked about, this cerebral spinal fluid is very clean. No wastes, no bad products can get inside your cerebral spinal fluid if it's working correctly. This is because you have a blood-brain barrier. We kind of talked about this with our astrocytes. This is our biggest player in our blood-brain barrier. Only the things that you want to get from your blood to your CSF are going to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, and the astrocytes regulate what can get through. So if you don't have astrocytes to hold that blood-brain barrier, the blood and the CSF are going to kind of get intermixed, and you're going to just have free flow of waste. So astrocytes create the blood-brain barrier. Keeping CSF clean, the blood has wastes and stuff in it that you don't want in that CSF. Glucose is one of our main things that is passed freely because your brain needs energy. Remember, glucose is energy. So your brain needs a ton of energy because it's working all the time. So you have a bunch of glucose that can get by that blood-brain barrier. Some hormones, but mostly glucose. Okay, exceptions to the blood-brain barrier. So like I said, if you don't have astrocytes, you're not going to have your blood-brain barrier. So these are places in your brain where you don't have astrocytes. Okay, so exceptions to the blood-brain barrier would be hypothalamus, posterior pituitary, pineal gland, and coronoid plexus. Okay, these are places where hormones are secreted. If you have hormones secreted in the brain, you want them to be able to get into your bloodstream. So you need to break that blood-brain barrier so the hormones in the CSF can transfer over to your bloodstream. Okay, so the hypothalamus is going to be our big one, and then your pituitary gland are the two that are super important. But anywhere with hormones does not have a blood-brain barrier, meaning it does not have astrocytes holding that barrier in place. Okay, and that's so the hormones can get from the CSF to the blood. The blood CSF barrier have specialized ependymal cells supporting microvilli connected by tight junctions that surround the capillaries. So where the blood is going to kind of transform into CSF, you have ependymal cells. So remember, your ependymal cells are what actually create CSF from last chapter. So if your ependymals create CSF, they work with the blood. They suck certain things out of the blood and spit it out on the other side, creating that CSF. So ependymal cells are what create our CSF, and it's because the blood is in little capillaries that the ependymal cells can suck the blood out of. The CSF out of. So again, ependymal cells create the CSF, and they pull the fluid from blood capillaries that are just right next to them. Ependymal cells create it. Capillaries are where the CSF is derived from. It's taken from blood, transferred into CSF. Okay, meninges, same as the spinal cord. Easy enough. You have the dura, arachnoid, pia. Dura is the tough mother on the outside. Arachnoid is the net-like one on the next layer, I guess, the middle one. And pia is directly on the brain. That's really all you need to know. You need to know more about these in the spinal cord. But no, the 3 cranial meninges are the same as the 3 spinal meninges that you learned about. Okay, brainstem. Here we go into my picture. So I normally like drawing things, but considering I'm drawing on this little tablet thingy, it's actually really difficult. So I took a picture. So sorry if it's boring to look at my picture, but here is my brainstem. Okay, so this might look confusing and you're like, I don't know where in the brain this would be, but the brainstem, this is where your spinal cord is going to come down. And we just took off that main, when you think of a brain, that cerebrum, we just took it off, and the inside of your brain and then the stem coming down. That's what this is a picture of. So if I went to this, you can kind of see that brainstem coming out of your main brain. Okay, so we're looking right here and then up in the middle of the brain. Like if we sucked out the middle of the brain and just took off the outside. That's what we're looking at when we're talking about the brainstem. Okay, right here, brainstem. Okay, medulla oblongata is going to be our first piece. This connects directly onto your spinal cord. So medulla oblongata would connect directly onto your spinal cord. There's a lot of information. I'm going to just try to point out the main general ideas to try to help you guys focus in your studying. The main thing your medulla oblongata does is it controls your heart and your lungs. Okay, so it controls the heart rate. It also controls where the blood is distributed in your body. So let's say you're running from a bear and you need your blood to get shunted to your muscles. Your medulla oblongata is going to actually do the constricting and shunting of that blood. Okay, so heart rate, force of contraction, how hard and fast your heart is beating, where blood is going in your body, and then it sets the pace of how fast you're breathing. Cranial nerves, Roman numerals are hard. This is embarrassing. 7 through 12, possibly. Yeah, I think. 7 through 12 come off of the medulla oblongata. Okay, cranial nerves are that table in your back chapter. You're going to have like 5 questions on this test and some on next test on those. So like really, really know your cranial nerves. You don't necessarily need to know where they attach besides your parasympathetic system that we went over last week, but know your cranial nerves functions, okay? So your cranial nerves 7 through 12 come off that medulla oblongata. And then this helps with balance, but that's not your main function. When you think of balance, we're actually going to think of your cerebellum back here, but it does contribute to balance. Main things on this: heart rate, blood distribution, respiration. It sets the pace of your respirations. Okay, those are the 3 big things with your medulla oblongata. And I lied. This is actually 8 to 12. I wrote it wrong. I apologize. But that's okay. You don't need to know numbers that come off of medulla oblongata. Just know that there's cranial nerves that do. Next, moving up, so zoom back out. Our medulla oblongata was connected directly to that spinal cord. Then we move up to our pons. Our pons, sorry, trying to zoom in. Okay, our pons is a sensory and motor pathway for cranial nerves 5 through 8. So 5 through 8 we're here, 8 through 12 we're here. 8 sits right between, so if I drew a little nerve coming off right there, it's on both the medulla oblongata and pons. So that's why 8 gets to be on both. Okay, so this is the motor information from your jaw, face, and eye, and inner ear. Okay, your inner ear helps you balance. So that 8 that we were talking about, that's the one that actually contributes to that balance. That's why medulla oblongata and pons get the inner ear balance. And then you just get motor information from your jaw, face, and eyes. It modifies whatever your medulla oblongata set your respiratory rate at. Your pons is going to be like, okay, that's great, but let's modify it a little bit, saying let's go either a little bit faster or a little bit slower. Okay, so cranial nerves 5 through 8, motor information, jaw, face, eye, and inner ear. Inner ear is balance. It modifies your respiratory rate. And then last thing, if you look, here's my little cerebellum coming off the back here. The pons is connected to the cerebellum. So it's how information gets from the brainstem back to the cerebellum. It's just that connection point. So the cerebellum, that's not, is not the greatest picture of a cerebellum, but your cerebellum sticks out of the back of your brain. It's like that weird looking thing dangling off the back of your brain. That's your cerebellum right there. Okay, and your pons is what connects the two. Okay, so that's pons. Moving up to midbrain. This might be a very fast lecture, which I'm sure no one is complaining. Okay, midbrain. This is all of, There we go. It includes your superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, this midbrain, and then your mammillary body. So like all of this is midbrain. Okay, so your midbrain, your superior colliculus is your visual reflex, while your inferior colliculus is your auditory reflex. Your midbrain is how we stay awake. Okay, your reticular activating system, those are the words essentially that mean stay awake. Your reticular activating system. Okay, so it regulates that sleep-wake cycle. That's in your midbrain. It also helps with limb position and muscle control. So it's your subconscious control. So this is like you're just standing there and you're doing things unconsciously. Like maybe you slouch when you stand and you do that unconsciously. That's your midbrain, that your limb position that is unconscious. So again, midbrain consists of superior colliculus, inferior colliculus, and this big midbrain body right here. Your visual reflex is your superior colliculus. Auditory reflex is inferior colliculus. Then you have your midbrain, which controls subconscious limb position, and then your reticular activating system, or staying awake and falling asleep. Okay, cerebellum. So back to our little dangly thing hanging off the back of our brain. Cerebellum, it's actually super cool. Hopefully in lab you get to look at these. I believe you guys are going to be doing sheep brains. But your cerebellum, the big thing with this one is balance, equilibrium, and coordination. So just remember those three words: cerebellum, balance, equilibrium, coordination. Any other question that asks about balance and coordination and equilibrium probably is not right. If it asks if the midbrain does that, no, the cerebellum does. Does your cerebrum do it? No, your cerebellum does. This is the part of the brain that's affected by alcohol. So you drink alcohol, it messes with this part of the brain. Your balance, equilibrium, it kind of is set off and you can't function as you normally would without having alcohol on board. Okay, so cerebellum. Cool. Moving up. Okay, your diencephalon. You can see my little note up here on my page that got kind of squished. Diencephalon is the pineal gland, so this right here, thalamus, this right here, and hypothalamus. So these three things are your diencephalon. Again, pineal gland, thalamus, and hypothalamus are part of your diencephalon. So to start, your pineal gland, this is the gland that puts you to sleep. It secretes a hormone called melatonin. Maybe you've heard about it before. People take it sometimes if they need help sleeping. Your pineal gland secretes this melatonin, which helps you fall asleep. It stops secreting melatonin when it wants you to wake up. Okay, if there's a hormone that I mentioned, memorize the hormone and where it comes from. Okay, so this is important. Your pineal gland secretes melatonin. It helps you fall asleep, and if it stops secreting, it helps you wake up. Your thalamus, I think that's what we're on. Yep, your thalamus is going to filter sensory information and emotion. Okay, so your thalamus essentially is a giant filter. It decides, it gets all the information from the brainstem that came up from your medulla oblongata up to your pons, to your midbrain, to your thalamus. And it essentially is like the mail station. It filters, it says, okay, this is where the sight information needs to go. This is where the smell information needs to go, motor, sensory, okay? So it's like your little postman. It sends the packages where they need to be. It also is involved in emotion, just filtering that emotion. Okay, so this is, your thalamus is your post office. It's where all the information comes and it sends it out where it needs to go into the brain. Okay, your hypothalamus. This is essentially everything. Your hypothalamus does all of these things. I'm trying to get it over without. Okay, I hate to say it, but you just kind of need to know, memorize this hypothalamus list, which kind of stinks, but you guys got this. So let's start hormones. Your hypothalamus secretes hormones. Remember I said if I say a hormone, know where it comes from and what the name of the hormone is and where it comes from. Sorry. So the hormone this one is in charge of is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, is your anti-peeing hormone, meaning that you're going to retain urine and not pee as much. Oxytocin is your hormone that helps you have babies. It delivers babies and helps with milk production in women. Okay, so your hypothalamus secretes ADH and oxytocin. That's your first big one. It controls your pituitary gland, which essentially does everything. And hormones unit, you're going to see your pituitary gland does everything in your body, essentially. Okay, so it controls it. It coordinates your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respirations, and digestion. So anything that's happening in your body that you're not consciously aware of, it's probably being controlled by your hypothalamus. Heart rate, blood pressure, respirations, and digestion. And then also, it helps with subconscious skeletal muscle contraction. So that was the same thing that happens down here in your midbrain. Okay, your hypothalamus just plays a part in that as well. Okay, big ones on this. It controls the things that you're unconsciously doing. So heart rate, blood pressure, respirations, and digestion. It controls those. It secretes ADH, oxytocin. It controls that pituitary gland. Last one, it controls your appetite. If this isn't working right, you can either have too much of an appetite or too little. It controls your body temperature. So if you're cold, it will cause you to shiver to heat up. And if you're hot, it will cause you to sweat to cool down. And it controls your sleep-wake cycle. So this has been like the third thing I think that controls your sleep-wake cycle. There's a lot of pieces involved in sleeping and waking up. Hypothalamus is just another player in that game. So hypothalamus, this is a long list. How I would do it if I were you, take it as you will. I would say number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then say there's 7 things I need to know about my hypothalamus. And then be able to list off 7 things. And if you can get all 7 off the top of your brain, you're going to be great. Okay, do that with your other things as well. So thalamus, filters sensory information, is involved in emotion. Pineal gland secretes melatonin. Just, that's how I found studying helps. If it doesn't work for you, that's fine. But there's just a little trick. Okay, your mammillary bodies, these little guys right here, they help with olfaction, so smell, and reflex movements. You don't really need to know what that means, but they help with smell. Essentially, it's their main job. Okay, the limbic system. My little note up here. So your limbic system is your emotions. This is where all of your emotions happen. So these structures, your amygdala, your hippocampus, and amygdala, hippocampus are not listed on this picture because they're so small, but they are actual structures in your brain. I don't believe in lab you can see them either just because they're so tiny, but they do so much. So to start, your amygdala, in part of your limbic system, remember your emotion system, links emotion with memory. So the first time you see a spider, you're not actually scared of a spider. You don't know to be scared of a spider. But let's say when you were a baby, your mom or dad, not be sexist, your dad freaks out because he sees a spider. You then link spider with a scared reaction and you become scared of certain things. Okay, so it links emotions with memories. So this could be like, let's say for some reason, a rose makes you really happy. To another person, a rose might not make them super happy, but you probably have a memory where someone either gave you a rose, you found a rose, and you were like, wow, this rose makes me, you connect that happy feeling with that memory. Okay, so emotion and memory, it connects them. That's your amygdala. Your hippocampus is your long-term memory. It's where all of your long-term memory is stored. Your hippocampus right now is trying to grab onto all the little pieces of information you're learning right now and trying to like retain as much as it can. One way to remember your hippocampus is if you saw a hippo walk across campus, you'd probably never forget it. It'd be stuck in your long-term memory. Okay, so if your hippo walked across campus, you'd remember that forever, long-term memory. Hypothalamus, to add to your list, it also is associated with rage, fear, pain, sexual arousal, and pleasure. Don't need to memorize that list. Just know that your hypothalamus also plays a role in intense emotion. Okay, cerebrum, moving on. Here's this. If you want to take a picture, go for it. If you want to draw it yourself, even better. If picture doesn't help at all, that's fine. But it helps for me. And that was really fast since I didn't have to draw it while I was talking. Okay, moving on to your cerebrum. Here's my little cerebrum. Okay, back of the brain, front of the brain. You can kind of see it. It's kind of a demented picture. I apologize, but hopefully it gets the gist across. So you have 5 lobes, your frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and then deep bedded in the middle of your brain, kind of surrounding that brain stem, is your insula lobe. So you can't see your insula lobe. If you just had a brain in your hands, you couldn't see your insula lobe, okay, because it's deep inside, deep in that middle. That's more anatomy, but that's okay. So your cerebrum, if I were to cut your cerebrum, you have, again, both gray and white matter. This time, your gray matter is on the outside and your white matter is on the inside. If you remember, that's opposite of what it was in your spinal cord. So it swaps. Your spinal cord has gray on the inside, white on the outside. Your brain has gray on the outside, white on the inside. Okay, that's why when you think of a brain, you think it's gray, because that gray's on the outside, white is on the inside. You can look up pictures. I probably should have looked up a picture of that, but yeah. I'm actually going to jump to a different picture. This little guy. Okay, so your brain has fibers that the different lobes can communicate using. That wasn't the best way to say it, but your lobes communicate using fibers, and there's quite a few different types of fibers. So your first is association fibers. You have 2, arcuate fibers, which pass from one gyrus to another. So a gyrus is like that hill. You think of a brain, you think of a lot of little wavy hills. A gyrus is just the top of that hill. So your arcuate association fiber goes from one hill to another hill. Your longitudinal fibers go from one lobe to another lobe. And these are association fibers. Both of those are association. So our first association, arcuate, is one gyrus to another gyrus. Your second association fiber is one lobe to another lobe. Your commissural fibers are fibers that jump from one side of your brain to the other side of the brain. So it communicates between the 2 different hemispheres. And then projection fibers link your cerebral cortex down to your brainstem or diencephalon. So it can link, this just has it from the frontal lobe. It just goes from anywhere in the cerebrum down into that brainstem, diencephalon, all of those things we just talked about on the last picture. So those are fibers. This is how your brain communicates with itself or sends information back down to your spinal cord. Okay. Basal nuclei, I would just read over that. I actually don't know a ton about those. Not super relevant in nursing, but that's okay. If you become a brain surgeon or OR brain person, you probably want to know those. Okay, back to our lobes. To start, so remember this is your cerebrum. You have in your different lobes, you often have your primary cortex and your association area or cortex. Okay, so occipital, for example, has a visual cortex and a visual association area. Okay, so a cortex and then an association area. Cortex, association area, not in frontal. Cortex, association area. Okay, so to start, let's just talk about what that means. That way I won't have to repeat it every time you get to a different lobe. So your association recognizes a stimulus. So remember your thalamus was your little postman. It sent letters to your different lobes, filtering information from your body up into your brain. So your your association areas found in the different lobes receive that message, receive that letter. Okay, and the letter is actually in like Chinese, not actually Chinese, but you can't consciously understand what that letter says. So that association area recognizes, oh, I have a letter, and then it's going to like translate it into something that makes sense. So it sends these signals that don't make any sense, unscrambles them into something that makes sense. Okay, so it'd be like getting your letter, opening it, recognizing, oh, hey, I got a letter, and then translating it into English so you could read it. Okay, that's your association area. It recognizes stimulus. Then if you move to your cortex takes that recognized stimulus and decides what to do with it. Okay, so sorry, I don't know. I just got a text and we'll go off. That's okay. So your association area receives the information and recognizes the stimulus, while the the cortex area decides what to do with that stimulus. I know that receive sensory information, like on this one, is confusing, but it's just receiving the information from the association area in a way that makes sense to your brain. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to say it one more time because I feel like that was confusing. Your association area receives the initial stimulus, recognizes that, hey, this is something that belongs in this part of the brain. Then it unscrambles it or interprets it in a way that makes sense to your brain and sends it off to your primary cortex. And that cortex is going to receive the information that actually makes sense to your brain and decide what to do with that information. Okay, hopefully that's clear. So to start, your frontal cortex. You have 4 different parts of your frontal cortex. Your first one is your primary motor cortex. This is what controls your voluntary movement. So frontal is motor, parietal is sensory. Frontal, motor, parietal, sensory. So your frontal lobe is your primary motor cortex, decides what your body is going to do voluntarily. So if I were to wave my arms around, that would be my primary motor cortex from your frontal lobe that's telling me to wave my arms around because it's voluntary skeletal muscle movement. Premotor cortex, this is your processing of movement. So you have to think before you act. So I have to think, okay, I'm going to wave my arms, and then I can wave my arms. That premotor cortex is where I came up with the plan to move my arms. It's processing what you're going to do before you actually do it. This is what controls, like, you know how to tie your shoe automatically, hopefully at this point of your life. It processes that so it can send off to your primary motor cortex, okay, tie your shoe. Okay, so it processes through and then sends it off to the primary motor cortex, which actually performs that action. Your frontal lobe on your left side has your speech center. So right here, you have your speech center. It's called Broca's area. This is what gives your brain the mouth movement, the jaw movement required to speak. Broca's area, it's on the left side of your brain. You also, if you've taken anatomy before, you have Wernicke's area. That's also on the left side in your frontal lobe. I don't believe that's in your book this time, but that's an important one to know for future classes. Speech, left side of the brain. I don't think you need to know that for this class, but forever and always after, you do. So know it. Okay, prefrontal cortex. This is the area that makes you you. Everything about you, your personality, your mannerisms, how you respond to situations, all of that personality, what makes you you, is in this prefrontal cortex. Okay, this is a super important part of your brain. If you get like Alzheimer's and your brain starts deteriorating and this goes, you become a completely different person because your personality is gone. That's why Alzheimer's patients oftentimes like lose their personality, because this part of their brain gets eaten away, which is super sad. But your prefrontal cortex is your personality. I'm sure maybe they didn't, maybe they did. If your teacher told you about Phineas Gage, that's the guy that had the rod that got shoved through his brain. I think it went from underneath and went all the way up through his brain in that frontal lobe. Super gruesome, but they pulled it out and he magically survived, but it wrecked that prefrontal cortex. So he was a super nice, happy, fun guy before. He became a grumpy, depressed, mean, awful guy after. This happened because it wrecked where his personality and his intellect was stored. This is also your smarts. This is where your smarts come from. So if you learned how to do math, this is where your math is going to be stored in that prefrontal cortex. Okay, so when you think about personality, when you think about your brain, your prefrontal cortex is probably mostly what you're thinking about. Okay, it's got a lot to it. Moving on to your parietal lobe. This is sensory information. So remember how I said association areas receive information, decode them, and send them to your sensory cortex so your sensory cortex can decide what to do with it? That's exactly what your parietal lobe does. Any sensory information that comes up first stops at your somatic sensory area, where it's received and recognized, decoded in a way that can be sent off to your primary sensory cortex. That primary sensory cortex decides what to do with it. Oftentimes, this sensory information will jump up to your frontal lobe, where your motor cortexes will send down a motor command. But it starts here in your parietal lobe before it can jump to that frontal lobe, because sensory comes before motor. Okay, so these work together to feel and interpret sensations in our body. So let's say I don't know, somebody brushed my hand and I felt that. These two work together. The brush, that information got sent up to my association area and was like, I have a stimulus. And then it interprets that as, oh, the stimulus was a brush of information. And it sends it to that sensory cortex where it can actually say, okay, your hand was brushed by someone else. And then that information can be sent off to your frontal lobe if you want to do something about it. Okay, temporal lobe. This is in charge of our auditory and olfaction. Okay, so auditory in your temporal lobe, olfaction first. Olfaction, exactly like sensory. You have a smell, that stimulus goes to your temporal lobe. You interpret, you receive that information and interpret it and send it off to your olfactory cortex, where you can recognize that as, oh, I just smelled bread being baked or something. Auditory cortex, auditory association area, exact same thing. Your auditory association area receives sound information, descrambled it into something that made sense, send it to the auditory cortex, which then recognized it as, oh, someone just said my name. Okay, so same thing, association area, cortex. Last one, occipital. Oh, in your bucket goes insula first. Insula lobe just has a gustatory cortex, meaning that this is just responsible for taste. Insula, taste. Insula, taste. All you really need to know. Occipital lobe is your sight. So again, your sight comes into your eyeballs, goes back to that visual association area. It receives that information, descrambles it, sends it to your visual cortex, which can interpret it as, okay, you just saw wind blow through the trees. okay? Hopefully that makes sense, association area and cortexes. Your frontal is the only one that doesn't really follow that rule, but the other 4 do. Okay. Oh, you do have Wernicke's area. Yay. Wernicke's area is how you understand what you've heard, which sounds a lot like your auditory cortex. So your Wernicke's area is like here, your frontal and temporal lobes work together, and they recognize sounds of what you heard. So this whole auditory cortex thing is happening in Wernicke's area and sending information up to Broca's area so you can speak. Okay, so you probably heard left and right brained. This is actually kind of a thing. Left brain is your language-based skills, reading, writing, speaking. Right hemisphere is your sensory relationships, taste, touch, smell, and emotion, essentially. So essentially just remember left is logic, right is emotion. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's just like the basic thing that you need to know. We are flying. What time is it? Cool. We're going to get done fast. Okay, levels of sleep. I'm going to actually do a little whiteboard. So you don't need to know in... Okay, sorry. Just a second. Apparently I'm struggling. There. Okay, so you don't need to know this in super great detail, but you have, for your information, you start here, you're awake at this level. You then go through like, I think it's 4 levels of getting deeper and deeper into sleep. Then you go through something called REM sleep. This right here is deep sleep. This is a graph. If you can't tell, I probably should have specified that. Awake is up here, sleep is down here. Okay, once you hit deep sleep, your body actually jumps up to this really interesting phenomenon called rapid eye movement. It looks like, if you're marking your brain waves, it looks like you're awake, but you're actually paralyzed and so deep asleep that you have no recognition of the outside world. So REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, is where you dream. Okay, I'm going to back up real fast. So as you fall asleep and you get into deep sleep, this is where your body is relaxed, your heart rate, blood pressure decrease. This is when you think of being a very peaceful sleep. You're in deep sleep. REM sleep is when, like, I don't know if you have a significant other that likes to kick and move in the night. That would be me in my relationship. I sleep like a gorilla. I'm all over punching, hitting, talking. It's fantastic. But that's because in REM sleep, you dream. Okay? Your blood pressure is going to increase. You are essentially awake, but you're not. You're consciously, your brainwaves think you're awake, but you're actually in a dream. Your muscle tone is going to actually decrease to the point where you can't move. You're paralyzed. Your eyes, though, however, are not inhibited. So as you're dreaming and looking around, your eyes can still move. But the rest of your body is paralyzed, and you become essentially dead to the world. This is the type of sleep that people are really hard to wake up from because they become very unresponsive to their real environment. Okay, so this is your dream sleep. You become paralyzed, everything but your eyes, so your eyes are moving around. You're dreaming. Your heart rate and respiratory rate are going whatever matches your dream. And it lasts for either 5 to 20 minutes. So if you're a person that's like, oh, I don't dream, I never dream. You actually do, you just don't remember it when you wake up. Everybody dreams. It's a thing. Because you have to go through REM sleep. This is essential to reach because if you don't reach this, you don't actually feel like you fell asleep. This is what you need to hit to get to a full night's sleep. And you hit this about 3, 4, 5 times a night. Once you reach your REM sleep, you're going to come back into your deep sleep, bump back up, drop back down, go into REM. Go back up, drop back down, go into REM until you wake up. So that is your sleep cycles. Hopefully that makes sense. So essentially, no, deep sleep is when everything is like shutting down, relaxing. REM sleep is where dreaming is occurring. You're not responsive to your outside stimulus. Okay, memory. Memory is pretty easy. Fact memory is a fact. Apple is red. That's a fact fact memory. 1 + 1 is 2. Fact memory. Everything you're trying to memorize in this class is a fact memory. Skill memory is going to be tying your shoe. It's something you know how to do. It's a skill that you have obtained. I feel like those are pretty self-explanatory. Memory consolidation is when you take a short-term memory and you try to consolidate it into something that's going to stick around forever in a long-term memory. You're consolidating a short-term into long-term. Remember, your short-term is going to be consolidated into the hippocampus, where you're going to have those long-term memories. Your cerebrum plays a vital role in what actually is stored. So visual memories are stored in your occipital lobe. Motor is stored in your premotor area. Memories, faces, and everything like that you see is stored in that occipital lobe. But the long-term things that are sticking around are stored in your hippocampus. Memory engram. Repetition, just to simplify it, repetition helps you remember things better. Memory engram, repetition helps you memorize things better. You have to actually have 7 exposures to something before you tuck it away in your long-term memory. So all of you who are cramming and are like seeing this information 1 time before you take the test, you're not going to remember anything because you didn't go through it 7 times. I feel as though I do the same thing, if I'm being completely honest. Okay, cranial nerves. This table in your book. This table is going to be your life. Make flashcards of it. It's a lot to memorize, but it's straight up memorization. Mnemonics. There's a mnemonic in your book if you like that. If you're a dork like I am, I like to use a Harry Potter mnemonic that I found. Starting from cranial nerve 1, it goes on. They traveled and found Voldemort guarding very ancient Horcruxes. Again, on. They traveled and found Voldemort guarding very ancient Horcruxes. So that's a little mnemonic for the names. A sensory motor mnemonic is every word that starts with S is sensory. Every word that starts with M is motor. If it starts with a B, it's both. So the mnemonic for this is some say marry money, but my brother says big brains or biceps matter more, whatever. So some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. Hopefully you can just rewind that and listen again so I don't have to keep repeating it. Okay, those for the name and sensory motor function. If you know it's sensory, it's pretty easy to think like, okay, olfactory is sensory, smell is a sense. It's easier to think through what the actual function is. You're gonna have lots of questions on these, so go over these. Don't skip over this table. I know tables aren't fun to memorize, but do your best. Know which numbers they are. So trochlear nerve 4, facial nerve 7. You need to know the numbers. Know if it's sensory motor and what that sensory or motor function is. And like I said, you're going to have questions about this on both this test and next test, and probably for the rest of nursing school. Okay, so Your cranial nerves are pretty important. Okay, I'm going to just move on because the next chapter is super short, but here's the moment if you want to stop before reviewing for the next test. I'm jumping from test. So everything we just covered is going to be on test, I don't know the number, either 4 or 5. And then everything from here on out is going to be on your next test, chapter 10. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking. Apparently she's having issues. Okay, chapter 10 is general senses, olfaction and gustation. Let me erase this. This is a pretty short and sweet chapter. Tonic and phasic receptors. I'm going to just mush fast and slow tonic and phasic into one. So you have 2 types of receptors in your body. You have tonic and you have phasic. Tonic receptors are known as slow adapting receptors. So tonic receptors are slow adapting receptors. So you get a stimulus. That stimulus is going to be relevant for a long time, and then it's going to decrease. A phasic is a fast adapting receptor. Okay, so this, you get a stimulus. Immediately that stimulus is going to start decreasing until the stimulus is gone. So this is fast. This is slow. Okay, so an example of this, your phasic receptors would be, your big one with this one is smell and temperature. Smell and temperature. Okay, so you walk into a room, it smells awful, and you're like, oh, that's disgusting. But then like 30 seconds later, you can't smell it anymore. That's because your phasic receptors decided that stimulus wasn't relevant anymore, and they turned off that receptor, so you're unable to sense that anymore. Okay, so smell goes away really fast. Another thing, if the AC turns on, cools up the room like 2 degrees, and then turns off, initially you're like, oh, it just got pretty cold in here. But then immediately, almost 30 seconds later, you're like, oh, I'm fine. Unless it's like freezing. This is small changes in temperature. Okay, so your phasic receptors are fast adapting, and the 2 examples of them are smell and temperature. There's more, but those are big ones that you need to know. Tonic receptors are slow. The stimulus that you feel does not go away until the stimulus essentially stops. And this guy, this one you need to know, is pain. Wouldn't it be nice if pain was a phasic receptor? But it's not. Your pain, let's say, what's a painful thing? I always come up with weird painful things. But let's say you hit your thumb with a hammer. You can feel that pain for a long time. Or let's say you're being burnt. You can feel the burn for a long time until you stop the burn from happening. And then even then, it's still receiving those painful stimulus. So pain does not go away. It's a tonic receptor. It's slow to adapt. You don't get used to pain. That's why people with chronic pain, meaning pain that lasts a long time and doesn't go away with treatment, are constantly in pain because they can't get used to their pain because their receptors are stubborn and they keep sending those painful stimuluses. Phasic is fast. Smell and temperature, they adapt really fast. You have 2 types of adaptation. You have peripheral adaptation and central adaptation. So peripheral, if you think of your PNS, is anything that's not part of your CNS. Peripheral adaptation is adaptations that's going to happen outside of your CNS. So this would be like your temperature. Okay, your temperature has to go through your skin receptors before it hits your CNS. So your periphery is going to turn off that stimulus peripherally before any of that information can actually go to the CNS. Central adaptation is going to be anything directly attached to your CNS. So smell is your big one for this. They're both phasic, but one uses peripheral, one uses central. So your smell, those olfactory nerve is connected directly to your brain. So your CNS, your central adaptation, is the one that's actually turning off that stimulus. So temperature is peripheral, smell is central. Only a tiny, tiny little percentage of all the stimulus we actually feel ever makes it to our brain. So let's say you put on socks this morning. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But if you did, you knew you put on socks. You felt them go on your feet. But until I said the word socks, you were not consciously thinking, you weren't aware that you had socks on. That's because your brain is like, or your peripheral adaptation is like, okay, we got our socks on, that's fine. That's information I don't need anymore. So we're going to turn off that stimulus so we're not overwhelming our brain with all that stimulus. People with Down syndrome, a lot of them, this doesn't work correctly. So they become overloaded with all the stimulus that's around them. That's why a lot of times they'll grab their ears and they'll rock back and forth. It's because their brain is completely overrun because their adaptation doesn't work correctly, which is super sad. Yeah, okay. Receptor classification, exteroceptors, external receptors. Proprioceptors are receptors that help us know our body position. This should be a review, so I'm going quick. And interoceptors are on the inside. Okay, proprioceptors are in our joints. We're going to go over those a little bit more. But exteroceptors externally receive information for your external environment. Interoceptors inside. Proprioceptors are proprioceptors determine where our body is in space. Okay, clear my little picture. Let's use purple. Purple's a good color. Okay, I'm gonna make a little chart. Simplify this down. I feel like that would be okay. You have lots of different types of receptors, but you mainly have 4 main types. You have nociceptors, thermoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, and chemoreceptors. Okay, these are our 4 main categories of receptors. Nociceptors are our first ones. They respond to pain. This is our pain receptor. They use a hormone called substance P. I feel like that's pretty generous. Substance P, substance pain. Pretty easy to remember. When substance P is released when you have extreme changes in temperature, so you get burned, you have mechanical damage, you cut yourself, you have dissolved chemicals in your body, so you have acid building up in your blood, or you have literally spilled chemicals on your skin, that hurts. Anything that's going to cause pain causes substance P to be released and sends a pain stimulus up to your brain. But the thing that actually detects pain is your nociceptors. Thermoreceptors detect temperature. Temperature. Thermo, like a thermos, temperature. So this, just a review, temperature is phasic and temperature uses peripheral adaptation. Okay, mechanoreceptors. There are 3 types of mechanoreceptors. Our first one is tactile receptors. These receptors are on your skin. So this is when you tactile, when you touch something or when something touches you, this is the receptor that picks up that information. You have a lot of different kinds. I wouldn't memorize that list if I were you. If you'd like to, go for it. But essentially know that this uses mechanically gated channels. Gated channels. Remember, mechanically gated channels are channels that open when you have a physical change in your cell membrane. Hopefully you guys remember that. Tactile receptors, what happens is the environment, something on the environment. So let's say my finger pushes on these cells and I physically break open that membrane of the cells, allowing sodium to rush in, sending a stimulus on. Okay, so tactile receptors use mechanically gated channels, meaning that you have to physically open them to get a stimulus to occur. Baroreceptors are baroreceptors. These are found in your blood vessels only. So they detect change, detect pressure changes, P-R-E-S-S-U-R-E, detect pressure changes in blood vessels. Okay, baroreceptors detect pressure changes in your blood vessels. So if you have low blood pressure, your baroreceptors are detecting that change. If you have high blood pressure, your baroreceptors are detecting that change. So it just is changes in the pressure in your blood vessels. Your last type of mechanoreceptor is a proprioceptor, and we kind of talked about this earlier, but proprioceptor. Okay, this uses 3 different types of things. It uses muscle spindles. It uses Golgi tendon organs. And it uses receptors in joint capsules. And what this one is, it detects change in physical position. Sorry, my handwriting is getting worse as we go. Okay, so proprioceptors. Proprioceptors is how I know my hand is behind me even though I'm not looking at my hand. I have muscle spindles in my muscle that detect where my muscles are, how contracted they are, what position they're in. I have Golgi tendon organs that can tell me how much tension there is in my tendons. And then I have receptors actually in my joint capsules telling me where my joint is in space. So I know that my elbow is up in the air. I know that my hand is in front of me even though I'm not looking at it. I know my feet are crossed under the desk without looking at it. So these 3 things work together to tell your brain where every piece of your body is in space without you having to look at it. That's how you can move your hands even though you're not looking at them. That's how you don't run into door frames. Maybe you do that too. I do that sometimes. But you're not supposed to run into door frames when you're walking through a small space. Your proprioceptors. Okay, everything that's in green is a mechanoreceptor. Okay, so if it asked which is not a mechanoreceptors, you could say any of these 3, but these 3 are mechanoreceptors. Okay, people get that confused because they put them in their own category, but all of these sense mechanical changes. Okay, last, chemoreceptors. Let's do this one. Pink, that sounds good. Chemoreceptors, as the name kind of suggests, receive chemical changes. The biggest one with this, back up. So if you see any question that has a chemical in it, hydrogen, oxygen, potassium, calcium, chemicals, then it's going to be a chemoreceptor. Okay? So our main buddy that we use this for in our body is hydrogen. Remember, hydrogen determines how acidic or basic your blood is. So if you have a lot of hydrogen in your blood, you're going to be very acidic, meaning that you're going to have a low pH. So chemoreceptors can sense chemicals. Chemicals determine the pH of our body, so we're essentially determining the pH of our body with chemoreceptors. Hopefully that makes sense. Chemoreceptors is the pH and chemical changes in our bodies. Okay, that is that in a nutshell. Okay, we have 2 pages left. Just finish up super quick, take a break. Okay, I don't believe I'm drawing anything else. Okay, I will just be looking at me for the rest of the time. Okay, olfaction. Olfaction is smell. Okay, so anything you smell is going to be going through your olfaction tracks up into your brain. Your olfactory nerve is nerve number 1, that cranial nerve from your chart. You have your olfactory receptors. If you remember, think back, I know that this was when we were still confused about classes and learning online, but do you remember your cribriform plate in your skull? You have your skull, it's up at the very front. It's essentially right here, deep inside a little bit, and it had a bunch of little holes in it. Your brain, your olfactory nerve, sends down little dendrite-like projections, little fingery projections through that cribriform plate up into the top of your nose. These cilia-shaped dendrites, if you see that in your future, don't get confused. It's not cilia, they're just hair-like dendrites. Stick down that cribriform plate into your nose, and they pick up odorants. Your odorant binds onto that little cilia-shaped dendrite and binds onto it and sends a stimulus up to your nose up to your brain saying, this is what we're smelling. Okay, so that's your olfactory receptors, is those little things that stick down your cribriform plate up into your nose. Your olfactory glands are just these glands inside your nose that secrete a bunch of mucus. So this is for protection, trying to keep all the junk out of your nose, but this is what makes boogers and grossness, is your olfactory glands. They secrete mucus. Okay, so olfactory receptors pick up odorants, bind to them, pick up information, send it up to your brain through that cribriform plate. Olfactory glands dump mucus into your nose. The olfaction pathway is what I just said. That odorant is going to bind onto one of those cilia-shaped dendrites. A depolarization is going to happen in that dendrite. It's going to send action potentials up into your olfactory nerve, that main cranial nerve, and then it's going to go back into your brain to your temporal lobe, that's embarrassing, temporal lobe, where your smell is interpreted. Okay, so there's 3 actual places that it's going to pass through on its way to the temporal lobe. These are super important. Your olfactory cortex, so that is your temporal lobe, your hypothalamus, and your limbic system. Smells are linked with emotion. So you've got your stimulus is going to have to travel through your limbic system so you can have an emotional response to smell. That's why you smell stinky. You're like, ooh, gross, nasty. Reminds me of junior high. It triggers an emotional response. Your hypothalamus, just everything goes through your hypothalamus, essentially. Okay, so your olfaction, this sense that came through your nose is going to go through your olfactory cortex, your hypothalamus, and your limbic system. Those 3 places. There's only 50 smells that we actually know. We just have like mixes of those 50 together. As you get old, your smell decreases. As you get old, your smell decreases. Okay, gustation or gustation. Taste. This one is your insular lobe one, your taste. Your taste buds on your tongue are what pick up this stimulus. You have lots of different types. You have filiform papillae. I don't want to like stick out my tongue and show you. That was my first reaction, so I'm not going to do that. But your filiform papillae fill in the gaps between all the others. Filiform fills in the gaps. That's their only job. They don't have taste buds on them. They don't have any function but to make your tongue a little bit more rough and to fill in the gaps between your taste buds. Fungiform. This is where your main taste buds are. Your fungiform. I like to think that if you ate fungus, you could taste the fungus. The fungiform, because your taste buds are on your fungiform papillae. At the back of your tongue, you have like a V shape. Boop. Actually, I think it goes this way. Boop. V shape of giant taste buds that have like 100 taste buds on them. So your back of your tongue actually picks up a lot of your taste, and that's your valate papillae. And then your folate, at the back of your tongue, you just have folds. There's no longer the nice bumpy tongue feeling, but you have folds. That's your folate at the back of your tongue and lateral edges of your tongue. Again, I wanted to stick out my tongue and show you, but I feel like that would be weird. Yeah, so filiform fills in the gaps. There's no taste buds on filiform. Fungiform, you eat fungus, you can taste it. So it does have taste buds on your fungiform, and that's on your main tongue area. Your valate taste buds are on the very back of your tongue. They form a V, and they have like 100 taste buds on each. So there's a bunch back there. Folate are the folds, the smooth folds found everywhere else. Okay, I'm going to simplify your gustatory pathway. Hopefully that's okay. So first, know these steps. Your cranial nerve, your taste buds are stimulated, and it's going to go up your cranial nerves. You have a few that deal with taste. Know those from your chart. They're your facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. Facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus nerves. Those three pick up that sense from your tongue. Your cranial nerves pick that sense up, send it to your medulla oblongata. Your medulla oblongata sends it to your thalamus. Your thalamus sends it to your insular lobe. So again, cranial nerves first. Your three cranial nerves send information to your medulla oblongata. Your medulla oblongata sends it to your thalamus. Your thalamus sends it to your insular lobe. Good? Just know that pathway. There are 4 taste sensations: sweet, salty, sour, umami. Sweet is sweet, salty is salty, sour is sour. Umami is like broth. Not salty broth, but like that brothy taste. And Parmesan cheese, apparently. So, sweet, salty, sour, umami. Umami is broth and cheese. Side note, I think of Friends, you know when Ross is like, unagi. Maybe that helps you remember that word, but you have unagi or whatever Ross says. Okay, you do have water receptors. Water does taste. You can taste water. If your nose is plugged, it makes it harder to taste things. There's probably a reason why. It probably says in your book. But plug your nose if you don't like to eat something, and it makes it go down easier. Just like smell went down with age, taste goes down with age as well. Okay, those two things decline as you age. Fraction and gustation. And that is all. That chapter is super short. Like always, if you have questions, email me, ask me. I'm here to help. Hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you next week.